Daniel Carter hadn't planned to start over again, not after losing his wife 3 years ago and raising his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, on his own ever since. Life had become simple, structured around school runs, packed lunches, bedtime stories, and quiet evenings that no longer felt empty, just different. He wasn't lonely in the way people assumed. He was careful about who he let into his life, careful about protecting Lily from instability, and careful about not forcing himself into something he wasn't ready for. But the people around him saw things differently. His co-workers believed he needed a push, something to bring him back into a world he had slowly stepped away from. So when they insisted on setting him up on a blind date, he resisted at first, politely declining more than once, until the persistence turned into something harder to refuse without seeming ungrateful. Eventually, he agreed, not out of excitement, but out of obligation, telling himself it would be a single evening, nothing more. What he didn't know was that the setup wasn't entirely kind. Behind his back, a few of them treated the situation like quiet entertainment, pairing him with someone they assumed would make the evening awkward, uncomfortable, something they could later laugh about. And as Daniel arrived at the restaurant that night, adjusting his jacket and preparing himself for a polite but brief interaction, he had no idea that the moment he walked through the door, he was stepping into a situation that would reveal far more about everyone else than it ever would about him. Daniel stepped into the restaurant with a quiet composure that had become part of him over the years, scanning the room once before moving further inside. It was a warm, softly lit place. Nothing extravagant, but comfortable enough to suggest effort. For a moment, he wondered if maybe his co-workers had meant well after all. Then his eyes found her. She was already seated at the table near the window, hands folded carefully in her lap, her posture slightly tense, as if she had been preparing herself for this moment for longer than he had. She was heavier than what most people would casually expect, and the way a few nearby tables had already noticed her presence said everything about how the room perceived her. But what struck Daniel wasn't her appearance. It was her expression. She looked nervous, but not hopeful, as if she wasn't expecting this evening to go well, only to be endured. When he approached, she stood up politely, offering a small, uncertain smile. "Hi, you must be Daniel," she said softly. There was a hesitation in her voice that didn't come from shyness alone. It came from experience. Daniel nodded, returning the greeting with a calm warmth that was natural to him. "And you're?" "Maya," she replied. They sat down, and for a few seconds, silence settled between them. Not awkward, just unfamiliar. But across the room, Daniel noticed something else. 2 of his co-workers were seated at a distant table, pretending not to look, their attention clearly fixed on the situation they had created. That was when he understood. This wasn't just a blind date. It was something arranged with expectation, not a connection, but a discomfort. And as he looked back at Maya, who was quietly adjusting her glass of water, as if trying not to take up too much space, Daniel realized something immediately. Whatever this evening was meant to be for others, he would not allow it to become that for her. Maya tried to begin the conversation the way people always do on first meetings, asking simple questions about work, daily life, and routine, but there was a carefulness in everything she said, as if she was choosing her words to avoid giving anyone a reason to judge her further. Daniel noticed it immediately. The slight pauses before she spoke, the way she kept her voice steady even when she seemed unsure, the way her eyes occasionally dropped toward the table as though she was used to being evaluated rather than understood. Across the room, his co-workers continued watching discreetly, exchanging quiet looks that confirmed what it already realized. They were waiting for discomfort, for awkwardness, for something that could later turn into a story. Daniel felt a brief moment of irritation, not because of himself, but because of the situation they had placed Maya in without her knowing. Instead of letting that irritation show, he leaned slightly forward, shifting the tone of the conversation deliberately. He asked her about things that mattered, what she enjoyed, what she spent her time doing, what made her laugh when she wasn't trying to impress anyone. At first, she seemed surprised by the direction, as if she hadn't expected genuine interest. Then slowly, something in her posture changed. Her answers became less guarded, her voice a little more natural, her expression less tense. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was real. And in that moment, Daniel made a quiet decision. Whatever expectations others had for this evening, he would not let Maya feel like she was part of a joke. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere at their table began to change in a way that stood in quiet contrast to the expectations surrounding them. Maya's nervousness didn't disappear completely, but it softened, replaced by something more genuine, as she realized Daniel wasn't treating her like a situation to manage, but like a person worth knowing. She spoke about her work, her love for reading, the small routines that fill her days, and though she still hesitated at times, there was a growing sense of comfort in her voice. Daniel listened fully, not out of obligation, but because he actually cared about what she was saying. Across the room, his co-workers began to shift in their seats, their initial amusement fading as the scene they expected failed to unfold. Instead of awkward silence or visible discomfort, they saw something steady, respectful, and unexpectedly sincere. Daniel noticed them again briefly, their presence now more irritating than before, and for the first time, he felt a quiet resolve settle in. This wasn't just about getting through the evening anymore. It was about correcting something unfair that had already been set in motion. When the waiter arrived, Daniel ordered without hesitation, and then casually asked Maya if she'd like dessert later as well. Not as a gesture of politeness, but as a simple extension of the evening. The question caught her off guard, not because it was unusual, but because it implied something she hadn't expected, that he wasn't looking for an excuse to leave. And in that small moment, something deeper shifted, not just in her confidence, but in the entire tone of what this night was becoming. As the evening moved forward, the ease between them grew in a way that felt natural rather than forced, and for the first time since sitting down, Maya allowed herself to laugh without hesitation. It wasn't loud or attention-seeking, but it was genuine, and Daniel noticed how quickly she tried to soften it afterward, as if she was used to taking up less space than she deserved. That small habit said more to him than anything else. He began asking her about moments that made her proud, not just comfortable, and at first she struggled to answer, clearly unaccustomed to being seen in that light. Slowly, she shared pieces of herself she likely didn't often speak about, how she had supported her family through difficult times, how she had built her career without help, how she had learned to stand on her own even when people underestimated her. There was quiet strength in her story, the kind that didn't demand attention, but earned it once noticed. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful, his responses measured but sincere. Across the room, his co-workers had stopped pretending not to watch. Their expressions now carried confusion rather than amusement. The situation wasn't unfolding the way they had anticipated. There was no discomfort to laugh at, no awkwardness to highlight. Only two people having a real conversation. Daniel glanced at them once more, this time with clarity rather than irritation. And in that moment, he made a decision. He wouldn't just ignore what they had done. He would address it calmly, directly, and in a way that left no space for misunderstanding. When the main course arrived, Daniel shifted the conversation in a way Maya didn't expect. Instead of keeping things light, he spoke about his daughter, Lily, about how losing her mother had changed everything, how learning to raise her alone had forced him to understand what truly mattered, and how carefully he now chose the people he allowed into their lives. His voice remained calm, but there was a depth to it that made every word feel intentional. Maya listened quietly, her expression softening as she realized he wasn't sharing this out of habit, but because he trusted her enough to be honest. Then Daniel said something that subtly changed the entire tone of the evening. He told her that he wasn't looking for perfection, appearances, or anything that fit into other people's expectations. He was looking for kindness, stability, and someone who understood what it meant to stay when things were difficult. The words weren't directed at anyone else in the room, but they carried clearly enough that even his co-workers, still watching from a distance, began to realize the situation was no longer under their control. Maya didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, as if trying to process whether what she was hearing was real or just temporary politeness. And in that silence, something shifted again, not in the room, but in her understanding of how she was being seen. For the first time that night, she wasn't questioning why she had been set up. She was beginning to question why she had expected so little from the moment in the first place. Daniel finally addressed what had been left unspoken the entire evening, but he did it without raising his voice or creating a scene. He simply leaned back slightly, glanced toward the table where his co-workers were sitting, and then looked back at Maya with calm clarity. "I know this wasn't set up the way it should have been," he said quietly. The words were enough. Maya's expression shifted immediately, not to embarrassment, but to understanding. She didn't need further explanation. She had lived through enough similar moments to recognize the pattern. For a brief second, a familiar disappointment passed through her eyes, the kind that comes from realizing you were part of something unfair again. But before that feeling could settle, Daniel continued. He spoke clearly, not for the room, but for her. He told her that whatever intentions others had when arranging this didn't define what the evening actually was, and more importantly, it didn't define her. His tone remained steady, but there was a firmness in it now, a quiet refusal to let the situation be reduced to something small. Across the room, his co-workers went completely still, no longer amused, no longer comfortable. They had expected awkwardness. Instead, they were witnessing something that reflected directly back on them. Maya listened without interrupting, her posture straightening slightly, as if his words were restoring something she hadn't realized had been taken from her. And in that moment, the entire balance of the situation shifted, not through confrontation, but through truth spoken at exactly the right time. The silence at the table was no longer uncomfortable, it was meaningful. Maya slowly processed Daniel's words, and for the first time that evening, she didn't feel like she had to shrink herself to fit into the space she occupied. Something in her expression changed, subtle but real, as if years of expectation were briefly loosening their hold. Daniel noticed it immediately, not with surprise, but with quiet satisfaction, because that was the point he had been trying to reach since the beginning of the evening. Across the restaurant, the co-workers who had orchestrated the date were no longer smiling. One of them shifted uncomfortably, attempting to justify the situation to the others in a whisper, but even he seemed unsure now. Daniel finally stood slightly, not abruptly, but with calm intention, and this small movement immediately drew attention from nearby tables. He looked directly toward his co-workers this time, no longer avoiding them, and spoke just loud enough of a message to carry without turning the moment into a spectacle. He didn't accuse them aggressively or raise his voice. Instead, he stated plainly that setting up a person to be judged or laughed at was not something he would ever accept, especially when it involved someone who had done nothing to deserve it. The simplicity of his words made them heavier. There was no space left for humor, no way to reinterpret what had happened as harmless. Maya sat quietly, watching him, realizing that the evening had stopped being about how others saw her, and had become about how she was choosing to see herself in response to it. And in that shift, something deeper settled, respect, not given out of politeness, but recognized as something she already deserved. After Daniel's words settled across the restaurant, the atmosphere changed completely, as if the space itself had grown quieter out of respect for what had just been said. His co-workers avoided eye contact now, the earlier amusement fully replaced by discomfort and realization. No one attempted to defend the setup anymore, because there was nothing left that could be defended without sounding worse. Daniel returned to his seat calmly, not to continue the confrontation, but because for him the point had already been made. Maya, however, remained still for a moment longer, her hands lightly resting on the table as she processed everything that had just unfolded. For years, she had grown used to interpreting situations through the lens of judgment, expecting subtle rejection or hidden disappointment. But tonight had disrupted that pattern in a way she wasn't prepared for. Daniel didn't look at her differently after speaking to them. In fact, his attention returned to her with the same steady presence it held all evening. That consistency mattered more than anything else. When the dessert arrived, neither of them spoke for a few seconds, but the silence between them was no longer uncertain. It was calm. Maya eventually asked him, softly, if he was always as honest with people, and Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile before replying that honesty was easier when you stopped trying to meet expectations that didn't belong to you in the first place. That answer lingered between them, not as a conclusion, but as something quietly meaningful, shaping the way the rest of the evening naturally unfolded without force or performance. By the time the evening came to an end, the atmosphere that had once been tense and performative had softened into something quietly genuine. Daniel and Maya walked out of the restaurant together, not as a dramatic conclusion to an arranged setup, but as two people who had unexpectedly found comfort in being seen without judgment. Outside, the night air was cool and still, and for a moment neither of them spoke, as if both were reluctant to break the calm that had formed between them. Maya finally admitted, in a small but honest voice, that she had expected the evening to go differently, that she had prepared herself for awkwardness, or worse, indifference disguised as politeness. Daniel listened, then simply said that people often assume too quickly what others deserve without ever taking the time to know them. There was no grand declaration between them, no sudden promise of what would come next, only a shared understanding that the night had revealed more than either of them had anticipated. From a short distance behind, Daniel's co-workers watched silently as he walked away with Maya, the weight of their earlier actions now fully settling in, without needing explanation. Nothing dramatic was said in return, but the lesson was clear in the silence they carried home with them. And as Daniel drove back that night, he realized something quietly powerful. Not that the blind date had gone perfectly, but that sometimes the most important connections begin in moments where people are given a chance to be seen as human first, and everything else second.